Yes, hello once more, and thanks for coming back to Classic Dirt Bike TV. Now, one of the good things about my YouTube channel is that no matter what part of the country you travel to, you more often than not come across interesting and sometimes rare bikes. And although this next couple of machines here are not that rare, and some might even say not really that interesting, but nevertheless, these two 490 Twinshock Maicos belonging to Irishman Stuart McClurg are still a decent pair of Twinshock racers that, as you can see, are anything but stock or original. But certainly they're worth a look here on my YouTube site. So first up, it's Stuart's Black Beauty, which is based around a 1981 490 frame and a 1982 or 83 490 motor. Now, this bike wasn't actually built by Stuart because this is a recent purchase by him, and it's a bike that originally belonged to Scottish rider Peter Maxwell, who I believe also has quite a good selection of these Maicos in his collection. But as you can see, it's certainly a different take on your standard red Maico to have it decked out in this black livery, which will probably maybe not please all of your hardened Maico aficionados who only like their Maicos in their stock factory red. But for me personally, I still think that this bike's been quite well put together, even although I've never ever been a fan of black wheels on a classic or vintage dirt bike. But beginning with the bike's chassis, which is of course your pretty stock standard 1981 frame, which has had all of its nice red Maico paint removed and then had what looks like a kind of powder coated black added in its place, although most of the bike's chassis still looks like it's still the original frame. It's also had a pair of replacement front engine mountings made out of alloy, which is probably just to allow that later 1982 or 83 engine to fit into the 81 frame. But it's all been very well engineered, as you can see. Now, the big Maico's power plant is a reed valve version of the iconic 81 490 two-stroke motor, but these later engines, of course, have the upgraded clutch and primary drive, which is completely different to the early 81 primary chain system, which was often quite troublesome because it stretched and even in severe cases broke altogether, causing all manner of problems. But these later motors certainly had a gear-driven clutch straight off the crankshaft, which was much more reliable and certainly better engineered. And naturally, the motor's crankcases have also had the same paint kind of treatment as the chassis, and these have been repainted black, which doesn't really have any particular practical application in terms of the bike's performance, but it's more than likely just to do with the overall black aesthetic looks of the bike. But certainly the 490's barrel has been spared the new black paint job, and it's just been left in its bare alloy. But as I said, this is the reed valve version of the 490, which is fitted with, I think it's a V-Force 3 valve block, and as per many of the other Maicos, it also uses a big Bing carburetor to feed it with its fuel. Now, it's normally just a plain black kind of plastic ignition cover that's used on these old 490s, but again a bit more bling here on Stuart McClurg's bike with this nice CNC machined billet alloy part, which, as I remember, I think were supplied by Bill Brown's Willsport Empire some years ago. Now, that handmade alloy primary drive sprocket cover is more than likely just been added by Stuart himself, because classic or Twinshock bikes in Northern Ireland need to have some form of sprocket guard fitted on them to allow them to take part in their race events. Now, on Stuart's bike here, there are quite a few parts supplied by Maico only bolted on to the frame, and this exhaust expansion chamber is almost certainly one of their products, because back a few years ago Maico only were renowned for shining up all of these Maicos and chrome plating these expansion chamber pipes just to make the bike a bit more appealing. But as to exactly why you would want to chrome plate a motocross bike's exhaust, I'll never know. But the bike's tailpipe is a quite good quality DEP unit from Derek Elwell Pipes, who make many different makes and models of replacement exhaust systems for all manner of these kind of off-road classic dirt bikes. Now, that rear brake pedal is another alloy item that was made by Maico only, and also the bike's both footrests are replacement wide heavy duty race base items, which of course are much better, wider, and certainly have more support for your feet than the skinny Maico originals. And the bike's seat, as far as I know, is the stock Maico seat base and foam insert, and this high quality seat cover is yet another part supplied by Racebase UK, who have all manner of bits and pieces to fit onto your Twinshock Maicos. Now, moving on to the back end of Stuart's Maico, it's a pair of top of the range piggyback Olin suspension units. And in terms of a good pair of rear suspension shocks for your old Twinshocker, then these Swedish-made Olin units certainly take a bit of beating, although, as they say in advertising circles, other suspension systems are available for these bikes. But as we move on to the front end of our German 490, it's the stock standard Maico front forks on this bike, painted black of course, just to match the rest of the machine. And the front hub again is just a standard Maico part with what looks like a Maico only alloy replacement brake torque arm there, and hub backplate and brake operating lever as well. Although, as you can see, this front hub has had all of its Maico ribs machined off, which was another Maico only trait way back in the day. But once again, more black parts on the rear of Stuart's bike with this black rear sprocket, and again an alloy replacement brake backplate, which was once more supplied by Maico only. And just as in the bike's front hub, this rear hub has also undergone the machining removal of the ribs, which I'm sure doesn't really serve any practical purpose other than maybe shedding a few grams of weight and adding a bit more bling to the wheels. But there's no escaping the fact that this is still a belter of a bike, and without doubt something completely different from your average run-of-the-mill 490 Twinshock Maicos. And although, as you're aware, I'm not really a fan of black wheels on a classic dirt bike, I have to admit in this case here on Stuart's bike, it still seems to work quite well with the black theme of the rest of the bike. But then again, that's the appeal about these old German Maicos, because spare and even upgraded remanufactured parts are still plentiful and readily available. So in that respect, you can see that it's quite easy to customise or personalise your old Twinshock racer. And so moving on to Stuart's second race bike, which this time is based on the stock original 1981 490 Mega 2, but this bike again has had a complete change of image. That's had the original factory red Maico chassis all repainted in this kind of silver metallic colour, but other than the chassis having been given a new coat of paint, as far as I'm aware, no re-engineering's taking place, and the bike has still kept its stock steel rear swing arm as well. So the motor in this bike of Stuart's is your 1981 reed valve 490 two-stroker that's had a fantastic reputation the world over for its brute power and good reliability. And if you can put a top-class rider in the saddle of one of these big German Maicos, then there's not many bikes that will pass you on the racetrack. And of course, these older 81 490s still had the old primary chain to connect the crank onto the clutch, unlike Stuart's 82 or 83 engine that we saw earlier that was gear connected. But this older transmission chain type system still worked perfectly well as long as you kept your eye on the primary chain for signs of wear, which, as I said earlier, in severe cases could sometimes break altogether and cause all manner of damage to the motor. But personally speaking, I did have the 1980 440 version of this 490 as a race bike back in the day, which I thought was a fantastic engine with a good spread of power, which suited me perfectly because it wasn't as violent in its power delivery as these bigger 490s. And again, up at the front end of Stuart's 490, it's the original Maico suspension system, which has also had a pair of socks added to the stanchions just to protect those precious fork seals from grit and other debris from the track. Now, the front hub on this bike hasn't had the machining that we saw on Stuart's other bike, although this alloy CNC machined backplate is a replacement to the Maico original. And again, the rear hub still has its original Maico ribs, or cooling fins if you want to call them that, but personally I think that Maico just added these ribs to strengthen that alloy hub. And once more, our 490 still has its stock original 81 steel swing arm, but of course not in your Maico red this time, but in this silver kind of powder coated colour. Now, on this second bike of Stuart's, it's not the Öhlins that we saw on the previous machine, because this time it's a pair of quite good quality YSS piggyback shocks, which are hugely popular among Twinshock racers these days. So it's obvious that these YSS suspension systems have quite a good reputation for their performance and their reliability, judging by their popularity and all of the riders who continue to use them. Now, the bike's exhaust expansion chamber isn't, of course, the original pipe, but a pattern replacement, which thankfully this time isn't chrome plated. And this rear alloy tailpipe is another product from DEP at Derek Elwell Pipes. Now I have to say that I've seen these Maico graphics before on another old Maico, which I'm sure was on Willie Burgess's 490, and I've not yet got to the bottom of its origins as yet, but I think it's to do with the old saying back in the day that these Maicos may go, or then again they may not. But that's just my take on the interpretation of this graphic. But once again, this is another superb bike from Stuart, a quite nice 81 490 Mega 2 with a whole brand new look done out in this white and blue graphics, with of course that silver repainted chassis there as well. And even in these modern times, these antique Twinshock Maicos are still highly competitive against more modern machinery, providing of course that you put a top class racer in that driving seat. And these old Twinshock 490 Mega 2s are still held in high regard with the world's off-road press and motocross riders of its day as still the very best open class Twinshock race bike ever made, mainly because of its handling characteristics and the sheer power that came from that ballistic missile of a motor, the awesome 490. Now, as far as I'm aware, Stuart certainly did have quite a good weekend while he was out on his black Panther 490 Maico. I'm not exactly sure how he finished at the end of the day, but he was certainly flying along when I saw him trackside at this charity race event at Craigantlet in Northern Ireland. But without a doubt, these have been a couple of very nice Twinshock Maicos from Stuart McClurg. So coming up next here on Classic Dirt Bike TV, we'll take a look at an award-winning CZ, and this feature bike here won the Don Matthews CZ World Championships in Marysville, California back in 2016, when it was ridden at that time by Irishman Trevor Calderwood. So make sure that you retune to CDB TV to take a look. So for the time being, keep safe and well on these old vintage dirt bikes, and we'll talk again very soon when we return to Classic Dirt Bike TV.